For those of you who for some reason clicked on a dungeon critique without wanting to be spoiled, I'll go over the spoiler-free stuff first. To start, I can't ignore the server fiasco on Spire of the Watcher's launch that resulted in the API being shut down for the better part of 4 days. It was quite shitty, but at least to me it was indicative of how this dungeon feels to play. This doesn't feel like a handcrafted project that was designed from the ground up to be fun and engaging. This seems to have been a dungeon that was cranked out so that Bungie could sell the dungeon key for $20. If you're looking for a good dungeon, go play Prophecy or Grasp. Alright, so now that I've set the tone for this review, I want to explain why I'm being so harsh. Money. The previous dungeons in Destiny 2 were side content. They were the 3-man raid. They weren't meant to stand on their own. To prove my point, you've only got to look at the first dungeons, Shattered Throne and Pit of Heresy. I mean, they didn't even have uniquely designed loot. These were quick, fun alternatives to finding a whole group of 6 for a raid, and the best part was they weren't any extra money. There was plenty of content to engage with if you didn't like a dungeon all that much. With this seasonal model, however, that isn't the case. If you buy the dungeon key, it's because you want to play the dungeon, so when said dungeon is poorly designed or recycled content, you can't say, well, it was extra content anyway, because it just wasn't. I bring all this up because Spire of the Watcher feels like extra content. It feels like an overworked team of devs cranked it out as fast as they could, fashioned some loot around it, and called it a day. This isn't to say the dungeon is terrible, it's not. What I am saying, however, is that when you charge a premium for content, then that content must be premium, and this isn't. Now, while we're still in the spoiler-free section, let's loosely discuss loot. The loot from, I can't bring myself to call this dungeon Spire because Spire of Stars was a great raid lair. I'm going to call it Watcher. Getting back on track, the loot from Watcher feels samey, and I can't lie, as a Crucible player I feel like I just got kicked in the nuts. I'll go into it deeper in the spoiler section, but all I'll say right now is that none of the loot feels like it was designed with us Crucible players in mind. Also, and I'm going to say this here because everyone who might buy the dungeon deserves to know, there are 6 weapons from Watcher, and 2 of them are reissued, non-craftable versions of the 7th Seraph Carbine and the 7th Seraph Officer Revolver. This sucks. You see, I have this rule when it comes to recycling loot that goes something like, the loot must be either unobtainable or outdated, and it must be good. These 2 pieces of quote-unquote loot violate all 3 parts of a rule that is only designed to have 2 parts. What the fuck? But let's go a little deeper. If Bungie had decided to put Adept Palindrome in the dungeon with new perks, I would have been fine unless they cucked the shit out of its perk pool like with Mindbenders. Hell, if Bungie had seen fit to reissue Fatebringer, call it Imago Loop, and give it a nice perk refresh and an origin trait, that would have been fine. What isn't fine, however, is reissuing weapons that are trash, are actively obtainable in-game, and not making them any better. I mean, they didn't even bother to give us more Warmind cell mods, or even buff the existing ones for Christ's sake. I know there is at least one person furiously typing away, or at least thinking, yeah, well they got an origin trait and fresh perk pools, so what's the difference? And please, if this is you, I beg you to consider the difference between a 360 auto rifle, a 180 hand cannon, and 2 pieces of exceptionally iconic loot that people who don't even play Destiny may have heard of. As for the origin trait, well, it has to do with breaking elemental shields, and both of these weapons are kinetic. Fucking L. Now for a brief spoiler-free review of the mechanics. All the mechanics in Watcher feel less fleshed out than in other dungeons, and I'd believe you if you told me that less than half the dev time of a usual dungeon went into this one. The bosses also feel off. There's just something wrong with the balance of the encounters that feels weird. So far, however, besides the servers crashing of course, I haven't run into any game-breaking bugs. This is an unexpected occurrence to be sure, but a welcome one. And with that, we come to the end of the spoiler-free section. So, if your tender ears are still around to hear the belayed end of this suspiciously long sentence that I specifically crafted just to give you a solid chance to click off the damn video, prepare to be spoiled. Firstly, let's talk mechanics. Now, encounter variety in Bungie's dungeons has never been their strong suit, so in order for a dungeon to be good, the mechanics introduced and then repeated must be fun or at least engaging. Are the mechanics introduced in Spire of the Watcher entertaining? Let's lay out what you'll be doing in this dungeon. To start, you'll be shooting wire nodes to open an iron trapdoor, then some platforming and pathfinding, then shooting some wire nodes to turn on a lift, then shooting some wire nodes to turn on a lift, then shooting some wire nodes to open a door, then shooting some more wire nodes to damage a boss, then some more platforming and pathfinding with a dash of wire nodes, fans, and doors, then finally shooting yet more wire nodes to damage another boss, and you're done. Now, I'm not going to be mad at you if you don't see the difference between this mechanic and mechanics in other dungeons like Grasp or Duality, but I will be a little disappointed. For those in the back, the difference is like many things, small but important. You see, it has entirely to do with flow. The flow of an encounter is how good it feels to play, so I'm going to try to explain it as well as I can with a comparison between my favorite dungeon, Grasp of Avarice, and this one. To fight the first boss of Grasp, Frisia the Insatiable, sick name by the way, you must kill an enemy to collect the Scorch Cannon it drops. Then use the Scorch Cannon to open up an area with enemies that drop engrams. These engrams give you a debuff that must be deposited in order to damage the boss. As a bonus, collecting 10 of these engrams grants your super, so the encounter feels unique, flows well, and has a fun twist in that you get your super back quickly if you're playing correctly. So, what would happen if you removed all the enemies from the encounter? It'd be impossible to complete and the mechanics would make no sense. Thus, the enemies are a necessary part of the fight, and killing them continues the flow of said encounter, making the experience loop into itself smoothly. Now let's compare this flow with the recycled from Garden of Salvation first boss of Watcher, Achilles, the Siren's Current. Goofy-odd name, what does it even mean? This encounter requires you to kill an orange bar Minotaur that gives you the Arctrician buff so you can shoot a bunch of wire nodes. Now, I haven't really spoken on this mechanic because I was saving this rant for now, so without further ado, why this mechanic is bad, precisely why I hate it, and why arbitrarily adding timers to things that don't need them increases their cringe factor tenfold. Why is shooting a bunch of things on the wall bad? Because it's frustrating. If you want to finish this encounter before the Pacific freezes over again, you need to memorize where they all are. They're also frequently in inconvenient places, which means you're now wasting time looking for a button under the stairs like the fucking boy who lived that probably hates you just as much as you hate it. As for why I specifically don't like this mechanic, it has to do with the fact that I like running double special, and when each of these little fuck you nodes takes a bullet to activate, well, double special doesn't really work when you're getting double fucked by a lack of ammo, does it? Now, as for the timer bit. Why are they timed unless you shoot them in the correct order? It really doesn't make any sense from a gameplay perspective, and often results in something I like to call a fucking bruh moment, trademark pending, where you were sure you shot one of the nodes already, but you've got to go back and shoot it again because it Epsteined itself before it could link the wire. Once all the nodes are shot, the boss, who has been following you around the whole time being an invincible pest, will then attempt to knock you off the tower with a repulsion blast unless you shoot all of his eyes. Then his bitch ass will run away from you so you can't deal optimal DPS. Adding to the frustration, it stops being vulnerable if you stop dealing damage, which will oftentimes cut your damage phase if you even take too long to reload. Then, no matter how much damage you deal, it attempts to fling you off the tower anyway. This DPS phase doesn't despawn enemies either, and because the arena is so open, said enemies will frequently put you in a shitty spot. So, like we did with Frisia, what would happen if we remove all the enemies from this encounter? Well, for the most part, nothing. The only enemy you need to kill is the Minotaur for Arctrician. In fact, the enemies are really only there to annoy you, slow you down, and drop ammo in the first place. Speaking of ammo, another issue is that many of the enemies that are following you around being annoying pricks are harpies, which, when killed, will drop your precious green and purple bricks into the abyss. This is convenient enough though, as it also happens to be where I feel like hurling myself every time it fucking happens. What this means is that the encounter has bad flow, quite a bit of jank, and feels bad to play because the obstacles placed in front of you are only there to slow you down. So, now that I've sufficiently proven that this specific encounter is cringe, I'm going to go back through and talk about each encounter, and then lastly, I'll talk loot. Let's start at the start because, well, you know. I actually like this encounter quite a bit, and it teaches the new mechanic quite well. The Cyclopses that spawn are a bit oppressive, but I understand that's kinda meant to push you into the buildings to see the nodes. The following pathfinding segment is also fine. Moving on to the climbing encounter, it really just emphasizes every problem I have with this wire node mechanic. It is, however, fun to memorize every single location like a fucking turbo nerd and execute a perfect climb. Next is the encounter with the Harpy, which I've already discussed, so I won't go more into it. The following encounter is literally the climb encounter in reverse though. Pretend I repeated the previous criticism here, because if I actually did that, then you'd stop watching. The final encounter is by far the worst. The main problem stems from the boss, as it's the most poorly designed enemy of all time, the Wyvern. This piece of shit chicken can kill an on-light max resilience guardian with full damage resistance in less than a second. It's also insanely quick, moves around the arena, and has a stomp attack that also lightly concusses you. Why? Because fuck you, I guess? Honestly, I don't get how this thing got past testing. Another problem I have with this encounter is the DPS phase. Besides requiring a metric shitload of wire nodes to trigger, I honestly don't take issue with how you get there. I do take issue though with what goes on during said DPS phase. The boss walks towards you with the end goal of stomping your face in, and since Well of Radiance isn't the only super in the game, you'd think it'd be balanced around that fact. Well, spoiler alert, it fucking isn't. If you're not running well, then I sure hope your DPS method is mobile, because this asshole has every intent to fuck with your DPS and or kill you, which should be fine, except the boss is also insanely hard to crit, has an insane amount of health when you're on level, and is just generally an asshole. I'm aware of the fact that Persys, I hate sharing even part of a name with this chicken bastard, takes 93% additional damage from a Warlock in their own Well of Radiance. But the fact that he only takes a reasonable amount of damage when you're legitimately dealing double the usual is insane to me. This boss fucking sucks. There ends the critique on mechanics. So now I'll discuss loot. The armor makes me look like a cowboy, enough said. The 4 weapons that drop from the dungeon are as follows. The 2-shot burst sidearm, Liminal Vigil, the double fire breach grenade launcher, Wilder Flight, the 120 RPM Deadman's Tail ripoff, Long Arm, and the 360 RPM LMG, Terminus Horizon. Now, I don't take issue with any of these weapons particularly, but notice anything missing? That's right, the foundry that made quite possibly the most popular hand cannon of all time, Last Word, doesn't have a hand cannon from this dungeon. You know what we do have though? A scout and a sidearm. 2 of the most frustrating weapons to face in the Crucible right now. This is why I mentioned that seeing this loot felt like a gut punch, because it feels like Bungie actively avoided giving us fun Crucible loot from this dungeon. Where's my Tex Sniper? Or my Tex Shoddy? What about a legendary that looks and fires like the first curse from Destiny 1? It's cool that the sidearm can roll Desperado, but Tex weapons were always made for the Crucible. Why aren't there at least some weapons from this dungeon that share the same sentiment? The exotic bow is unique, but in the end, it's just another exotic bow in a game full of them. Maybe it's the coolest thing ever, and if it is, I'll take that L standing up, because Tex isn't a bow company, it's the goddamn Cowboys, damn it. This dungeon made me sad. Subscribe. I'm out.